All right, welcome to The Explainer. Today, we're diving into a really fascinating source that tries to build a purely logical case for, well, for existence itself. It lays out its argument like a step-by-step quest, all to answer one of the biggest questions we've ever asked. So, let's follow the logic and see exactly where it takes us.
And it all starts right here with this massive question, famously put into words by the philosopher Gottfried Wilhelm Leibniz. Why is there something instead of nothing? It's the ultimate why, isn't it? The source material we're looking at today doesn't just, think about this question. It actually tries to solve it with a pretty strict logical framework.
So, how in the world do you even begin to tackle a question that big? Well, the source we're examining suggests a really powerful method of elimination. This approach is drawn from a passage in the Quran, and it gives us a set of 4 possibilities that it claims are completely exhaustive. That means any possible origin for the universe has to fit into one of these 4 boxes.
Okay, here are the 4 options on the table. The whole argument hinges on a process of elimination. The claim is pretty bold. If we can logically disprove 3 of these, then the one that's left, no matter how wild it sounds, has to be the truth. So, let's start digging in. Let's put that first one to the test. Option 1. Could the universe have just popped into existence from absolute total nothing? We're talking no cause, no energy, no pre-existing space, just pure, empty nothingness. According to the logic in our source, this idea is a non-starter. It immediately breaks a fundamental rule of reason, causality. The idea that every effect has to have a cause. Since absolute nothingness has, well, nothing, no properties, no power, the source concludes it's logically impossible for it to create a whole universe. So option 1 is off the table. Now, I know what you might be thinking. What about quantum physics? We hear about particles popping out of a vacuum, right? But the source makes a really critical distinction here. The quantum vacuum is not absolute nothingness, not even close. It's a buzzing, fizzing soup of energy that's governed by physical laws. It's definitely a something, which means it doesn't solve our ultimate origin problem. Okay, so if the universe didn't come from nothing, maybe it was its own creator? Could it have somehow pulled itself into being?
The source argues that this is a straight-up logical contradiction. For something to create itself, it would need to exist and not exist at the same time. Think about it. To do the creating, it has to exist. But if it hasn't been created yet, it doesn't exist. You can't be your own parent. It just doesn't work. So, based on that logic, option 2 is also out.
All right, this brings us to option 3. What if our universe was made by something, which was itself made by something else, which was made by another thing, and another, just stretching back forever and ever? A never-ending chain of creators. This is what philosophers call an infinite regress, and it's a huge problem. It doesn't actually answer the question, why is there something rather than nothing? It just kicks the can down the road, infinitely. If every single cause needs a cause before it, you never actually get to a real beginning, a first cause that explains the whole chain. It's like a staircase that goes down forever. It has no foundation.
To push back against the idea that maybe the universe just is, that it doesn't need an explanation, the source gives us this great little analogy. Imagine you open your fridge and there's a first aid kit inside. Your first thought wouldn't be, oh, well, it's just there. You'd immediately ask, who put this here? How did it get here? The source is saying the universe is just like that first aid kit. Its existence is so strange and specific that it demands an explanation. So, we've gone through 3 options, and the source has dismissed each one as logically impossible. So what does that leave us with? Well, only one possibility remains, that the universe was created by something that was itself uncreated. Let's really unpack what the source argues that has to mean. The source then gets very specific about what uncreated or independent must logically mean. For something to be truly independent, it argues, it can't have any parts or be made of anything else. It can't depend on space or time or anything at all to exist.
it can't have a beginning, and it can't have physical limits. Because if it had any of those things, it would be dependent on something else, and we'd be right back where we started. It has to be totally self-sufficient.
And this table really lays it all out, putting the universe side by side with these criteria for independence. As you can see, the source points out that our universe is completely dependent on every single point. It's got building blocks, atoms and quarks. It relies on things like space, time, and physical laws. It definitely had a beginning, the Big Bang. And it has very specific, limited qualities. The argument, then, is that its creator must have the exact opposite attributes: indivisible, self-sufficient, eternal, and unlimited. And here's where the source connects this chain of pure logic back to scripture. It points to this description from the Quran, from Surah Ikhlas, which almost perfectly mirrors the attributes of the independent creator that the argument just deduced. It describes a being that is one, eternal, and completely unique, unlike anything in creation. Okay, so now, armed with this very specific, logical definition of what a creator must be, the source basically turns it into a filter. It then uses this filter to evaluate different theological ideas and see if they hold up. First step is deism. This is the idea of a creator who, sets the universe in motion and then just leaves it alone. The source argues this doesn't make logical sense. If a creator is perfect and unlimited, those qualities should include things like mercy and justice. And abandoning your creation, it argues, is neither merciful nor just. This naturally raises the question of free will. If there's a merciful creator, why give us the ability to choose evil? To explain this, the source uses this really neat robot analogy. Imagine a robot that's programmed to obey. It has no choice. Now imagine a second robot that has free will, but it chooses to obey you, maybe out of love or gratitude. Which act of obedience has more meaning? The source suggests that this is why humans, with our ability to freely choose good, are so significant. And that line of thought leads directly into how the source tackles the age-old problem of evil. The argument goes like this. For our free will to actually mean anything, the option to choose evil has to be real. Therefore, this world is framed as a kind of temporary test, a place to separate those who choose good from those who choose evil. And in that context, things like suffering and injustice are seen as parts of that test, with the promise that ultimate perfect justice will be sorted out in the afterlife. So, applying that same logical filter again, the source looks at polytheism, belief in many gods, and concepts of a composite god, like the Christian Trinity. The reasoning here is that any god made of different parts, or any system with multiple gods in it, would mean they are limited and dependent on each other. And that directly contradicts the criteria we already established for a single, indivisible, and totally independent creator. So after all that, the logical funnel has narrowed things way down. The argument has led to a very specific kind of monotheism, belief in one indivisible God. Now the source moves to its final step, comparing the remaining candidates, Islam and Judaism, by looking directly at their primary texts. And this is the final comparison in the source's argument. It uses two main criteria: how logically direct the text is and how well it's been preserved. It argues that the Quran contains explicit, rational arguments for God's existence right there in the text itself. On the other hand, it suggests that the Tanakh more often assumes God's existence, with logical proofs being developed later by philosophers. Then, on the second point, it brings up the textual integrity of the Quran, contrasting it with what it describes as known variations between ancient manuscripts of the Tanakh. And that is where this specific source concludes its argument. We've basically followed a single, long, logical path, all the way from a universal question down a funnel of elimination to a very specific answer. It really just leaves us with one final thought to chew on. If you decide to use pure logic as your guide, where does that path ultimately end? Thanks for joining us on The Explainer.